this is the third of these National Security Action Summits that our organization and its partners have put together. Two of them thus far in Washington. This is the first of what we hope will be several that we're taking to states like South Carolina, states that are important in their own right, of course, but also in terms of where they are as testing grounds for the kind of people that John Bolton was just talking about. In each of these meetings, we hope to do what we're going to start with in this panel, which is to present to you some of the best people in the country in this particular portfolio, with one or two of them drawn from sort of national level roles and prominence, and one or two of them drawn wherever possible from states like this or its neighboring states, so that you get a flavor of both what is being done or needs to be done or isn't being done at the national level and what can be done here as well. So without further ado, you again have bios for each of these remarkable men in your packages and available to you online. Let me just say the quickest of words about them. The first of our speakers will be a dear friend of mine, a man who has distinguished himself in many respects. He's a Mustang, as they call him, having served as an enlisted man back in World War II, having risen through the ranks to the rank of a 4-star admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He has been the chairman of the Military Committee of the Center for Security Policy in recent years, and something of a rock star of late, because, as I suspect he will do again with you, he has unburdened himself of some of his rather strong views on subjects, and we're hoping that he will do so here today on the question that we're addressing right now, which is the hollowing out of our military, the implications of that in the kind of dangerous world John just talked about, and what we do about it. He will be followed by Peter Huessy. Peter is one of the most knowledgeable and I think influential experts on national security in Washington, D.C. For a variety of reasons, he's worked on these issues for a long time, including on Capitol Hill, but also because he presides over a really important breakfast series that meets every couple of days and brings in top people to talk to other very knowledgeable and influential figures on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in Washington about the condition of our military. Notably, but not exclusively, the problems with missile defense and our nuclear forces. So we're looking forward to having Peter's comments on those issues. We are going to be very pleased to have with us Lieutenant Colonel Bill Connor, who many of you may remember as a candidate for the United States Senate in the last round. He also brings an extraordinarily impressive background to this subject as a former Army Ranger, a man who has served, I think, with distinction in uniform and is happily continuing his service out of it. And finally, Danny Strickland, another Ranger, also a member of Delta Force, veteran of 24 years in service in uniform. Now continuing his service with Congressman Jeff Duncan as one of his military advisors. I'm very pleased to say that while Congressman Duncan regrettably was not able to be with us, we do have a letter, I believe, that we will read at some point in the proceedings. But in the meantime, we're going to be very happy to have one of his go-to guys with us as well. So without further ado, I will invite Admiral Lyons. Would you like to come to the podium, sir? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with a great bunch of Americans. And this is kind of like a homecoming for me. My daughter's a Gamecock. So you Clemson Tigers, beware. I have to tell you, never in my lifetime did I think I would be witness to this great country being taken down and withdrawn from our world leadership role by our own administration. Incredible. You know, you have to ask yourself, if you believe America's greatness and an exceptionalism, why would you fundamentally want to change it? It makes no sense. That's why sequestration, with its draconian budget cuts, was the perfect vehicle for the administration to unilaterally draw down on our military forces. You have to recognize that the defense budget only represented 20% of the federal budget. However, defense was required to absorb 50% of the sequester cuts. That's almost $1 trillion over 10 years. Unbelievable. And what's the impact been? Well, as Ambassador Bolton mentioned, we're going to have the smallest army since prior to World War II, 420,000 troops. That they can't do an exercise above the company or battalion level. That he's not sure, according to the Chief of Staff of the Army, that he could prevail in a major regional war. Unbelievable. The Air Force, according to the Chief of Staff, Mark Welch, he's not sure in a combat situation that he could control the air war. Only 50% of our squadrons and bombers are combat ready. Individual squadron readiness is at 50 to 60%, when it should be at 85 to 90%. And then we get to the Navy with its anemic shipbuilding program. According to the Chief of Naval Operations, if he loses a few more ships, we'll be down to a regional power. We now have roughly 270 ships. And let me put that number in perspective for you. That's about as many ships as I had under my command in the Pacific Fleet. And with the shipbuilding program we have, we could go down as low as 240 ships. This is unbelievable. And the Marine Corps is in the same situation. So we have a major problem. We really have a national security crisis. Now, while we're unilaterally disarming, our potential enemies have been modernizing all their strategic nuclear and conventional forces. It's unbelievable that we could continue in the direction that we're going, knowing the threats that we face. Now, compounding the problem is the social engineering that has been imposed on our military forces. The removal of don't ask, don't tell, moving women into combat roles. This has all had an impact on our readiness. It's affected morale, unit integrity and cohesiveness, and most importantly, the will to win. Clearly, sequestration must be reversed. The military budget cuts, the caps that our services have been forced to absorb must be removed, as well as the social engineering that is imposed on our military forces. Don't ask, don't tell has to be reinstituted. And as I've said many times, there's many viable jobs for women in the military. Combat is not one of them. Now, there's another thing I have to tell you. This administration has great difficulty in identifying the enemy. It's not violent extremism. It's not radical Islam. Erdogan, when he was Prime Minister of Turkey, said it best. Islam is Islam. There are no modifiers. Democracy is the train we ride to achieve our ultimate objective. Now, Islam hasn't been reformed in over 1,300 years. You know, there are 109 verses in the Quran that sanction violence. In chapter 2, verse 106, on abrogation, it says plainly that the more violent, later violent verses supersede the earlier, less violent verses. It can't make it any plainer. So here we have a courageous president from Egypt, President al-Sisi, on New Year's Day, giving a speech to the leading Sunni clerics and charging them with the reformation of Islam. Monumental declaration. I hope his insurance policy is paid up. But instead of, you would have thought such a statement would have been embraced by this administration and our allies. It didn't even get the tip of the hat. So that tells you where their sympathies lie. Now, I want to say a few words on Iran and Libya. Iran has been at war with us for over 35 years. They've caused thousands of American deaths. They caused over 1/3 of our losses in Iraq. And of course, they were responsible for our Beirut Marine Barracks bombing. You should never forget that it was Iran that provided the critical training for the 9/11 hijackers. Without that training, 9/11 couldn't have happened. 3,000 innocent Americans would be alive today. So here we have this administration trying to negotiate an agreement with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Does this make sense? Absolutely not. And then I can tell you this. All the leading scholars have finally come to their senses and have concluded if Iran gets the nuclear weapon, deterrence will not work. So as I've been trying to do for 35 years, the only way to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is a military strike. You have to destroy their nuclear weapon facilities. Now I'm going to tell you something else. With this kabuki dance that's going on in Geneva over the nuclear weapon negotiations, there was an article written by Michael Ledeen in the New York Times last year. It got little attention and was quickly withdrawn. And in that article, it said, after President Obama got the Democratic nomination in June 2008, he opened up a secret channel of negotiations, communications with the Iranian mullahs. And what he said was, do not make an agreement with the Bush administration. I am a friend of the Iranian theocracy. You will like my policies. You will get a much better deal waiting for me. And of course, they have. Actually, he granted them their enrichment objective. Now, who was this secret channel? It was Ambassador William G. Miller who reported all of this to Michael Ledeen. Clearly, we have to wipe out that nuclear infrastructure. You see, Frank's giving me the hook again. Let me just say this on Libya. The war in Libya never had to happen. Gaddafi was ready to abdicate. There was no humanitarian crisis. What we did in Libya was switch sides. We armed the Al-Qaeda militias and the Muslim Brotherhood militias. There was no humanitarian crisis. And it's those same militias that took down our special mission compound and caused the loss of 4 brave Americans. And of course, the pathological liar, Hillary, then went on to try and spread false information. Now, I've got to tell you, while this great country is being taken down, we have a constitutional crisis. And what I'd ask you to do is you recognize we have to change the Republican leadership in the House and Senate. I just got a note from Frank. Please wrap it up. Let me say it's been great to be with you, and God bless America.
You have no idea how much it kills me to cut him off, but there's a show to run here. Peter Huessy.
Frank, I want to thank you for inviting me to come down to talk to you, and it's wonderful to be in any place outside of the Beltway in real America. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill when he was told that the Brits were going to sign an arms control agreement in the 1920s that would limit the size and speed of destroyers. And he said, "Build slow destroyers? That's like breeding slow racehorses." We are in the process of breeding slow racehorses in our entire national security apparatus. All of you have moved a number of times, I would assume, in your life. I'm assuming that many of you who are in the military have moved a dozen times. I'm always curious, when you go to a neighborhood, what's the first thing the mother asks the realtor? What are the schools like? The second thing they do not ask is, there aren't too many police in the neighborhood, are there? And the crime rate's really high, right? My friend John Bolton is right. We don't want to be, nor should we be, what is referred to as the world's policeman. But where we want to operate in the world, we want to be safe for prosperity and freedom. And in 1960, when John Kennedy became president, we had $80 billion worth of trade with the world. Today we have $3.6 trillion. That's just in and out of America. Two numbers, 80 billion, 3.6 trillion. In 1960, 50% of the budget of the United States of America was the defense budget. 49 billion out of about 100 billion. Today, the defense budget is 12% of the federal budget. And the amount of money we spend buying weapons and doing research on new weapons, adjusted for inflation, is no higher than it was at the bottom of the nadir at the end of the Cold War in 1995, which at that time was $65 billion. Adjusted for inflation, it's now 105, which is about where our procurement budget is. We are buying weapons at the same rate that we did at the end of when the Cold War was over, when we were told, remember, by Mr. Fukuhama, that it was the end of history and that there were no more threats. So remember those. In the 1970s, we tried what we're trying today. We delayed everything. We came up with what was known as the Hollow Army. I remember when I went to work for President Reagan in 1981, he sent General Doherty and a group of us around the country on military airlift command planes, and we went to every major military base in America. And I could see that the planes didn't fly, the tanks didn't have enough gas, the ships didn't steam, the barracks and the equipment that our soldiers lived in and used, the homes you would not put your dog in. But there was a change in the eyes of all those enlisted men and officers with whom I went around with General Doherty. The eyes said, the man in the White House has our back. And everybody knew that, and then the money came, and the policy came. Ask yourself this question. In 1978, Saddam Hussein came to power, and a year later launched a war against Iran. In 1979, Khomeini came to power and launched a war against America. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and we know where that led. Ask yourself, was that not connected to the fact that in the decade of the 1970s, America built a hollow army and a hollow military and elected Jimmy Carter president of the United States of America? Yet we have people in this country who tell us there's no connection. Now, we're in God-fearing country, and as the grandson of an eminent Christian theologian, I'm always wondering, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Pope John Paul, were all came into office within 22 months. They were all attempts were made on their life in an assassination. The fact that they lived and the fact that they were elected tells me unequivocally there is a God, and he watches over us. Now, if he's watching over us, we have a responsibility to watch over ourselves, do we not? In 1993, when President Clinton came into office, the defense budget was $300 billion. By 1995, when the Gingrich Congress came in, it had dropped to 260. Over the next 6 years, with the help of a number of members of Congress, particularly from South Carolina, particularly from the South and other parts, we built that budget back up to $300 billion when President Clinton left office. But that entire decade, that trough, let me go through what happened. World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. 200,000 people would have died if those trade towers, if the one had fallen into the other. And by the way, the man who built the bomb, Ramzi Youssef, his uncle is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And ask yourself the question, why did nobody ask then who was behind the bombing, which I'll get to in a minute. In 1993, the CIA was attacked. If you remember, out on the streets of George Washington Parkway, Khobar Towers, the embassies in Africa, the Murrah Building in Oklahoma, the USS Cole, Mogadishu, and Black Hawk Down, if you remember. We were attacked over and over again by terrorists around the world and here in America. And if you take the 4 major books on Clinton's foreign policy, 2 written by friends and 2 written by basically opponents, but nonetheless excellent books, particularly the Kagan's book called While America Slept. They all asked the president in different times the question of going after state sponsors of terror, which is Iran, which is Syria, which is North Korea, which is Cuba, which is Nicaragua. And oh, by the way, it's not on the list, but I'll tell you what, Russia and China are also state sponsors of terror. We know it, everybody knows it, but we pretend otherwise. What's fascinating is Bill Clinton had the same answer every time he was asked, what about the state sponsors of these terror attacks? He said, that is too hard to do. And guess what? We didn't go after them. And guess what? 9/11 happened 8 months after the next president was put into office. Now, let me tell you something. Richard Clarke, if you remember, got up in front of the 9/11 Commission before Congress and said, I apologize. We didn't go after Al-Qaeda and so forth. Well, but he did is he smeared the Bush administration saying that they didn't have their eye on the ball. Let me tell you something. You need to hear this. In June 2000, Richard Clarke testified before Congress, before Chris Shay's subcommittee on terrorism and unconventional threats. He gave a briefing on terrorism. He was asked, what are the serious threats we face from terrorism? And he said, I can't tell you that because there are too many. And then he was asked by Chris Shays, and by the way, this is in a letter Chris Shays sent to Condi Rice and to Richard Clarke a month after his testimony, and then 6 months later when Condi became NSC advisor. His second question to him was, well, would you tell us how to prioritize our spending on counterterrorism? And he said, we are thinking about it. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, what date did I give you that he testified? June 2000. That's almost 8 years after the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. If George W. Bush and his people had told Congress 8 years after the World Trade Center bombing of 2001 that what are you doing about counterterrorism money and prioritizing it and helping with the military, and if they had said, oh, well, we'll get to it, what would have been the reaction of the United States media? This letter has been made public to every journalist in Washington, D.C. by Chris Shays. I've written about it about a dozen times in various essays. We're in the same position now. We have a media that just simply will not pay attention to the issues. Admiral Lyons went through some of the things we're losing. Our Air Force, when Ronald Reagan became president, was on average, every plane was 12 years old. Today it's 27. General Herrensack, who runs the nuclear program for the Air Force, his son is flying the same B-52 tail number as he was. Not the same plane. The B-52s are Model H's. That's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. It's a lot, okay? General Herensack's grandson is just graduating from the Air Force Academy, and he's going to go into flying B-52s. And guess what plane he's going to be flying? Exactly the same plane that his grandfather flew. Now, people tell us we don't need a strategic bomber. We only have 20 B-2s that are capable of doing the intelligence gathering, surveillance, and reconnaissance that a bomber does. It's not just something to drop bombs. It has to do with the surveillance of the area. It has to do reconnaissance. That's what its suite of electronics does. The only planes that can do that in the 2020s are the B-2. We only got 20 of them. That's why we need a new strategic bomber. If I went through the litany of Yemen, Libya, Nigeria, Ukraine, North Korea, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, the South China Sea, Venezuela, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? These places are a mess. And yet we have a White House that says we've never been safer. And yet we have a director of national intelligence, Mr. Clapper, who I just read his testimony again last night. He said, there have never been more terror groups in the world than there are today, arrayed against the West and the United States. And remarkably, he said, there have never been more state sponsors of terror as there are today. Let me conclude. Ace Lyons is right. The budget cap was invented to kill the Defense Department, not enhance our security. The thing is that the Republicans said, no, we're not going to agree to massive tax increases to hurt the economy and throw us down the tubes economically in order for us to save defense. But now, Paul Ryan saved defense the last 2 years with that budget agreement with Senator Murray. We're now in the place where we don't have that anymore. Okay, and we only got partial relief. The budget cap's about $32 billion in what we're talking about. Let me give you a final thing. I read General Accounting Office reports. Do you know that the earned income tax credit fraud and child tax credit fraud comes to $20 billion a year? Do you know the majority of the people who file such fraudulent returns are illegal aliens? Do you know they file them by the tens of thousands from one post office box in places like Atlanta and Houston? That's just the beginning of where we can find money in the budget. We have got to be like Chuck Schumer was in 2009 when he was asked, would the stimulus package be $100 billion? And he said, what? No, I think it should be $860 billion. And the national media didn't blink. Congress didn't blink. They passed it. We can be just as audacious. Do what we have to do to protect America, and that means get rid of these stupid budget caps, set the stage for a sound American security policy, and elect a Ronald Reagan conservative in 2016. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Connor, next up. Thank you very much.
Admiral Lyons, Frank Gaffney, it is first of all tough to follow you, Admiral and Peter Huessy, and I see so many people out here I saw on the campaign trail, so good to see you again. It is wonderful to be here. I'm going to start with a caveat that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense or Department of the Army. Even though I'm still serving, I'm speaking as Bill Connor. And I've got a unique story to tell. Father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all career military officers. As many of you know, I was born in Hawaii when my dad was in Vietnam, and I've got my birth certificate, as I've made clear to everybody here numerous times. But I saw those decades, and I want to do a quick rundown of what I saw both as a military brat, coming to a military college in the 1980s, commissioned 1990, spending half my time on active duty, half my time reserve, going overseas numerous times, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and give you an idea of what the, in this case, the Army. Now understand, the Army follows along with the other services, so my comments really apply to all four services. The 70s were a terrible time. I can recall my dad coming back from Vietnam. He was not treated very well. His fellows were not treated very well. The Army went from over 1.5 million in 1968 down to only about 750,000 by 1974, cut in half. It went to an all-volunteer force, but unfortunately, they didn't pay for the all-volunteer force. So I can recall being on posts like Fort Hood and seeing what Peter Huessy already talked about in the Hollow Army of the 1970s. And General Shai Myers, who was Chief of Staff of the Army in 1980, called it in front of Congress a hollow army because he was opposing Jimmy Carter's budget at that time. It was a terrible time. Now, my father was stationed in Europe in 1981, and we spent 5 years there. In fact, I graduated high school there in 1986. And it was amazing to see a transformation that occurred in our military, going from the terrible 70s to what it was in the 80s. It was one man, and Peter Huessy mentioned him, Ronald Reagan. They put the money into it. They gave the benefits. They gave the pay for an all-volunteer force, which you've got to do to keep quality people in the Army. Because you'll volunteer for war and patriotism. If you got a family, you've got to pay them, you've got to take care of them. In the 1980s, we did. We built the National Training Center to train our battalions, our brigades on how to fight. We had the warrior ethos, which is something I'm going to talk about because it's something right now that our military is losing. The warrior ethos at that time was the top priority because Ronald Reagan said he was going to win the Cold War, and darn it, he did. He won the Cold War because he put the spending in the U.S. military. He brought pride back. We knew that he had our backs. I was a cadet during part of that time. I was commissioned in 1990, and we saw what happened in Desert Storm. Now, one of the things we saw was a change in public perception from the terrible times of the 70s, where the public did not treat the military well, to Desert Storm, where, gosh darn, we were treated like kings. When I went over there to Kuwait afterward, it was amazing to see the change in the public perception. But we went through another drawdown, and that was the Cold War drawdown, from about 16 divisions, close to 800,000 people, down to about 500,000. And there were some problems with that drawdown, but not near as bad as the 1970s. We moved into Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which at least kept some of the cultural issues at bay. We had to put up with Bill Clinton during that time frame, and that wasn't easy. There was a feeling of a zero defects mentality, which is really the only problem I saw as a junior and mid-ranking officer. That as they cut people out, they were looking for issues, problems. Then we had 9/11. When we started 9/11, it was estimated 75% of our combat units were trained and ready to deploy, which, by the way, in 2013, that went to 10%. Initially, we started out, we were trained, ready to deploy, and we thought it would be pretty quick. We'd go into OEF, we'd be done, we'd be back, but then came the counterinsurgencies, and it wore our military down. It did. Part of the problem is that when you're doing counterinsurgency, as an infantry officer, and by the way, I'm not JAG, I've stayed infantry, you've got to train in the NTC at battalion, brigade type level to be good at what you do. Counterinsurgencies, you lose that training. Our equipment was run down, our helicopters, our vehicles were run down. By 2006, they were talking about that. The public support started out very good, but it started tapering off. And then came the 2011 and the withdrawal from Iraq. And speaking from someone who was, again, serving, we had some terrible things happen. During this wear down of the military, the multiple deployments, all the things that we had to deal with, the administration decided on a peace dividend to go from 570,000 in the Army to 490,000. Not a good idea at that time because they were assuming we could pivot to the Pacific and not worry about things that came up like ISIS, like going back to Iraq, like Ukraine, all these sorts of things. And guess what else happened that year? End of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The idea that we're going to gender integrate the special operations, infantry, the combat arms, all at once with a military that's been worn down after all these years of war. So we came to 2013, again, 10% of our combat units were trained. Real quickly, just some quotes from the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Odierno, in January 22nd of this year about some issues going on. The Army is down 50% in modernization, 50%. And that's the money used to build ourselves back up, like they brought into the Reagan era, the Bradley, the M1 tank, the Apache helicopter, 50%. 2013, again, 10% of the Army was trained. We're now to about 33%. Again, compare that to 2001, 75% were trained. Sequestration is not a good idea. I'm going to tell you that you guys know how conservative I am. It is not a good idea. When I hear conservatives talk about this, it's a cop-out for Congress because they don't have to go in and take the hard votes. It's all targeted at the military, and right now military spending does not need to continue going down. What it's done now is we've dropped below 490,000, and we're heading toward 420,000. That is absolutely unsustainable with what's going on with ISIS, with the Ukraine, with cyber warfare, and everything else. Here are the three areas I'm a little concerned about right now, and I'll talk about this during question and answer. First of all, the dangerously low number of ground troops. We have got to keep, as a nation, we spend a lot of defense spending, we really do because we have to, But as far as ground troops, for a nation of 330 million people, we're one of the last as far as numbers of ground troops. You can compare us to China, to Germany, all these countries. And what that means is the same folks go overseas over and over again, worrying about the PTSD issues, the family issues, the suicide issues, and all that. That can't sustain ourselves. You know, I was in Afghanistan. One of the quotes that was joked about was, America's not at war. America's at the mall. The military's at war. That needs to end because that's not part of our nation's history. And that leads into the second concern. Congress in the 1970s was over 70% veteran. Most of that combat veteran. It's now less than 20% veteran and only a handful of combat vets like Tom Cotton. Let's give a cheer for him. He's a fellow airborne ranger. We need more veterans. I can't believe we had 10 years of war, and a tiny number of veterans in Congress making the decisions during this time in our nation's history. That's a concern. Also, quite frankly, the voting population. Vietnam, again, 1.5 million with a much smaller country, 500,000 fighting in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We got a tiny number of Americans who understand the military, and that's why some conservatives cheer on sequestration, when if they're true conservatives, they'd never be doing that, because Reagan was a conservative, and he would have never cheered on sequestration. Last thing is the warrior ethos. You know, what it takes to get particularly combat arms units, special operations units, to face the enemy, to face death, to be willing to give their lives and kill somebody is part of the warrior ethos. That's built up. That takes work. It takes what we did in the 1980s with the NTC, with the CMTC, with training for combat and focusing not on sexual harassment training as the prime focus of the military right now, focus on war fighting and taking on this group called ISIS, which they are not going to be a nice group for our guys to face. And here's what I'd end with is we're responsible for the decisions that Congress makes with our military. If they lose the national defense, we're gone. Douglas MacArthur said it right. There's no other area, when we're talking about national defense, where the consequences of bad decision making are so devastating and irreversible. If we lose our nation, it's gone. People die, they're gone. So what I'd end with is this, is please take this bit seriously. Please take the message back to conservatives that if you're a conservative, you're a Reagan conservative, you believe in a strong military, taking the fight to the enemy, and not cutting ourselves down to nothing. Thank you so much for having me up here. I'm honored to be with all of you, and great to see you again. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill Collier. Denny Strickland, welcome. Thank you for your service, sir. Next, over to you.
Thank you, Frank, Admiral Lyons, Peter, Bill, ladies and gentlemen out here. As soon as my presentation comes up here, because I worked in the Pentagon, we will naturally do PowerPoint. Very young in my career, I had an opportunity to meet a gentleman named Walter Shoemate. Walter Shoemate was the first enlisted man ever assigned to the Army's elite Delta Force. And I was fortunate enough to have that man as a personal mentor. Walt and I were discussing one afternoon the importance of thinking, training, and learning, how they all work together. How your mind must be actively engaged in the absorption of knowledge and information and processing it, much like all of you people clearly are involved. His advice to me that day was, Danny, if you ever find yourself the smartest man in the room, not that there's a remote chance of that ever happening, he said, you're in the wrong room. Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you I'm in the right room, and I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay. Yep, once again, PowerPoint. Well, we'll drive on without it. When the presentation comes up, what you're going to see is the Department of Defense definition of readiness, of what the mission of the United States military is. It's pretty straightforward. Fight and win our wars and be prepared strategically to adjust from one threat to the other. It's a very difficult thing to do, to balance all of those things. You need a robust military in a country or a world as dangerous as it is today in order to do that. What we have done, however, is we became reactionary in our posture. And that's our current posture, assuming it was at 100% strength. Our military is about a third the size it was the day I joined it. So we can react to different things. But there's going to come a time when we may have to react to two different things. Or there may come a time when we should be reacting to a second thing and can't. ISIS immediately comes to mind. What we're doing now is allowing Iran to take the lead in fighting ISIS because we can't or won't. Regardless, that is an issue. I think we're going to get my pictures back, which would be kind of awesome. There we go. There's that Department of Defense definition I told you about. When we talk about America's defense in decline, there's about 35 to 40 different points of national power we can go through. But specifically on the military, these are the three things that are impacted by our leaders in Washington. The personnel, training, and equipment of our military forces, and that regardless of which branch, are all on the decline, dangerously on the decline, some to the point where it would take almost a decade to recover the readiness posture we had just a few years ago. If you take a look at this chart, this goes all the way back to the American Revolution till today. Take a look at the two spikes in the chart there. Now, on the left is your military personnel total, and on the right is the percentage of GDP being procured for national defense. Let's dig into those numbers a little bit. In 1940, you can see the size of the Army, and we'll just look at the Army. You can see them all the way across the board. In 5 short years, look what that became. That is a monumental mobilization of the entire country. There wasn't a family in the United States that was not impacted by World War II in one way or another. But then look by 1950 what we had done in a drastic downsizing. But what happened in 1950? Well, we needed another spike because another war happened. And you see how rapidly that ramped up. I had this discussion not too long ago, and a person of a different political persuasion than probably most everybody in this room looked at my chart there and said, well, there's nothing absolutely wrong with that chart. It shows that we have fantastic ability to mobilize and surge forces in a hurry. But let me explain how that argument works to think that way. That is to brag about surviving 3 snake bites and never acknowledging that killing the snake would have probably been a pretty darn good idea up front. So that's what I would say to our great mobilization forces. When we mobilized forces for World War II, and I'm going to get into the dangers of this in a minute. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of complication. I know we're weary and nobody wants to hear me. First ground operation, World War II, was called Operation Torch in North Africa. We had 3 American groups and 1 primarily British group land in North Africa in November 1942. February of 1943, we've been on the ground less than 2 months. The American Army was arrayed. It was fairly well equipped. There was plenty of them. And finally, the Germans decided to do a little probe and see what we got. Now, this is a hot mess, and nobody outside of Bill Connor understands what this is. Bill knows what it is. But all that red you see, that's Field Marshal Erwin Rommel going through the American lines like a hot knife through butter. And the reason for that was because we had men on the ground. They weren't properly equipped, and they were certainly not properly trained. This is what happens with that great surge right off the bat. You can get carbon-based life forms to the front, but if they're not equipped and they're not trained, this is what's going to happen. And to put that in numbers that you would see today on the headlines of the New York Times if it happened again, after 2.5 days of battle, this is the results. 10,000 men, 183 tanks. That's an armored division was killed or missing within 48 hours. We're getting real dangerously close to this happening again. Not with the current active force we have, but should we have to do a massive surge like we did in this case, it could happen again because raw troops are going to be on the front. There's no question about it. I want to introduce you to a gentleman some of you may be familiar with. This is Lieutenant Colonel Charles B. Smith. And I don't know if you would say he's one of the luckiest Americans that ever lived or the unluckiest. I suppose that would depend on your point of view. He was a 1939 commissionee from West Point. And in 1941, he found himself a first lieutenant serving with the 35th Infantry in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, on Oahu. Beautiful place, a little before Bill's time, but beautiful place, no question about it. December 7th occurs. At the time, First Lieutenant Charles Smith with the 35th Infantry managed to mobilize Delta Company, which he was commanding as a first lieutenant, to tell you how short we were. He managed to get 41 men gathered out of the 129 that he should have had assigned to him. And they ran out to the point on Barrows Point and set up a hasty defense where they only had 11 rounds of ammunition apiece, waiting on a ground attack. Now, had there been a Japanese ground attack that day, how long do you think Lieutenant Smith and his 41 guys would have lasted? But they did it. They went to the point of the spear, fully prepared and knowing beyond any shadow of a doubt that if that ground attack comes, they would die. It was just a matter of when. There was no question they were going to die, but they did it anyway. All right, so fast forward. Lieutenant Smith is eventually assigned to the 21st Infantry Regiment, spends 4 years of distinguished service in World War II. After World War II, he decides to stay in the Army. He has by this time gotten married, and he moved his wife to Japan with him. He's a lieutenant colonel. He's commanding the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry of they're in occupation duty in Japan. To keep this in perspective, understand that his battalion was authorized strength was a little over 400, and at the time he had about 250. They were poorly trained because there's no place you can maneuver tanks and very little rifle engagement at long range. There's just no resources to do that sort of stuff in Japan. We were basically being MPs in occupation duty, and that was it. Nobody was training to be infantry. But then the world didn't stay as calm as everybody wanted it to, especially if you're in occupation duty in Japan. June 25th, 1950, everything in the Western Pacific changed. 89,000 North Koreans came across the DMZ into South Korea, and it was on. Within 4 days, the capital of Seoul fell, and just one day after that, the U.S. military decided we needed to put boots on the ground in Korea to help defend it. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was tagged to fly out of there from Japan into the Pusan Peninsula, where he was to establish a blocking position until other forces could get there. Now, at this point, if Lieutenant Smith thought that he was in a desperate situation in Hawaii a few years earlier, the idea of his 400 men facing 89,000, you can imagine what these guys must have thought. I can imagine being in, I did 25 years active duty, 24 actually. And I've been in some situations that were less comfortable than others. But can you imagine every one of those guys probably wrote a letter to his family and gave it to his buddy? This is what happened within 48 hours. To suggest that it's okay that our first line of defense takes these kind of casualties is un-American. Amen. I'm going to take a look at this real quick, too. This is resources where in the Army piece it's identified as men in uniform, and the Navy it's ships, and of course Air Force it's a fighter and attack aircraft. Take a look at this line. That's aircraft. Oh, I'm sorry, naval ships. Pre-World War I levels. To suggest that we have the same capability of force projection today that we did just 10 years ago is to deny reality. The current administration's plan after the sequestration goes through 2017 because of the 10 years we're going to lose on that. And this is where we wind up. That is totally non-sustainable. We can't keep a force on the ground at those numbers. And it's not a left or a right thing totally either. Former Secretary Leon Panetta, certainly not a conservative, agrees 100% with the assessment. These are line items that was in that last $1 trillion budget. And I think I'm going to get to something that you guys will be interested in here in a second. These are, big, huge ticket items. But what's interesting about every one of them is they were put in there by our Congress people. The Pentagon did not ask for them. And in often cases, what the Pentagon will do after they get these line items is they will defer budgets because the Pentagon didn't want it. All this stuff is produced in congressional districts where Congress people decided they'd stick it into a budget, sticking their nose in where it don't belong, frankly. 1976 was the first time that entitlement spending in the United States became more than defense spending. And you can see the trend line all the way up. What I'd like to point out is that trend line right there, where at least we stabilized that for a few years. Notice the years those are? We stabilized that for 8 years. That was a man named Ronald Reagan. This is my last slide, and I'll let it go with this. And I'll tell you that this is a very emotional event, emotional subject for me. Because not only did I serve for a very long time, I have 2 children also, sir. Got a daughter who's a JAG officer on active duty now, and a son who unfortunately has been medically retired after his 3rd Purple Heart. So there's skin in the game. Take a look at this. This is from Jane's Defense Weekly. This is a United Kingdom publication that analyzes military posturing around the world. It's probably one of the most recognized and respected resources there is. Top 20 declining defense budgets. Only Slovakia and Venezuela. Think about that. The most powerful nation on earth, number 3 on that list. That should shame us all. Notice, however, who is not on that list. You don't see Iran. You don't see China. You don't see Russia. When we're on a list that they're not on, and it's this list, that's a very, very bad thing. And I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of who's in the White House, this will not change until we change leadership in the Congress.
Because we got a late start and because we've got an awful lot of other things to do, I'm going to ask your indulgence to keep the question period relatively brief here. These gentlemen, I think, will be around for the rest of the day and be happy to talk to you. I wanted to start with this particular story because it is hard to talk about any of the other things we're going to be visiting about in the course of this program without having a grounding in what we're doing unilaterally to disarm ourselves. So I want to thank these extraordinary men for helping clarify just how bad that is and what the stakes are. So we'll take a couple of questions. Direct them, if you would, to anyone you'd like. If you would identify yourself, that would be appreciated.
Yes, sir. I'm Conrad Long, and I don't know, I mean, Colonel Bill Connor or the whole panel, you know, just general advice. I was wondering if y'all had any recommendations for a young man like myself heading into the military in this situation today, and what one can do about it outside of the ballot box.
You ought to join the Navy.
Well, I'm sure you're going to get a little competition on that point.
As I say, I mean, first of all, let's cheer on Conrad Long, not only being accepted to the Citadel. I have no Conrad, but he's a Citadel scholar. Good job, Conrad. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
And again, I'm speaking as Bill Connor, not Lieutenant Colonel Connor, not a spokesman. When I say this bit, is I've gone through struggles of being in now almost 25 years. Do I stay in? Do I go with what I see going on? And it's been a struggle. Because I'm seeing things. I talked about the cultural changes. But here's the bottom line is, this is the defense of our nation. If we get this wrong, we're gone as a people. All the freedoms we have are because of those who are defending us. If we give up, Conrad, it is gone. So I'd encourage you to hang in there. Keep your head down low initially. Keep your belief structure. But understand what's right. Understand that there will be help. There's a sovereign God out there, and I believe he will bring redemption, including within the military. But I would say this much, that it is a tough one for young officers to think about. Do they stay in? Do they join? When there are things like, for example, the muzzling of our chaplains, the seeming muzzling of Christianity, and those kind of things that, by the way, build the warrior ethos and build the ability to put your life on the line, knowing there's something beyond this life. But you bring it in. And when you're talking to your guys, you stand firm, and help will be on the way.
Amen.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like
Danny?
If I can, I'd like to add one little thing to that, especially for young people. I've done a lot of talking to them. I'd say this, and you can say this to your own kids or grandkids who are thinking about the military as a service. Number one, if the Army ever offers you a cool hat and a little extra money, there's cause for trepidation. I'm just going to tell you. So just be aware that not everybody needs to be jumping out of airplanes.
Peter, anything?
Well, I've been working for the Air Force since March of 1981. But my favorite job is the job I don't get paid for, and that is to teach at the Naval Academy in Annapolis a course on nuclear weapons policy. And I would agree with the Admiral. Join the Navy, join the Air Force, join the Marines, join the Army. We need good people. And from within, do your job and get us going in the right direction. It's a great life. It's a great career. These are the finest people I've ever met in my life. And as I said, I think I've worked for literally hundreds of different admirals and generals and enlisted people. There are no finer group of people in this country than in our armed forces.
Yeah. Amen. Yes, sir.
My name is Scott Black. I'm a member of the Greenville Tea Party. I'm also a member or a student of Center for Self-Governance and Keeping the Republic in Greenville. We are pushing the closed state primaries issue at a table here. My question is, a lot of people nowadays, many Republicans especially, invoke the memory of Ronald Reagan. God bless him. The reality that I have learned recently is that when he was attempting to run for president, the Republican Party vehemently opposed him running for president. They did not want him to get the nomination. They did not feel they could control him. How do we combat the established forces within the Republican Party that are trying to keep our strongest and best candidates from making it becoming their candidate for office? How can we combat that?
This may be, if I may say, a question that you'll want to address to some of the other folks who will be up here in due course. I'm not sure it's particularly appropriate for these guys, but anybody want to respond?
That's what primaries are for. And the polls show that even on Fox News, the two favorites are Walker and Rubio. And I'll tell you what, you put them in as president, vice president, I don't care which way you do it, that will be one of the most extraordinary sea changes in American politics. I like Mr. Cruz. There are a lot of, we got what, 30-some governors in this state, a country of Republicans. All of them would be better than the folks in the White House today. So just, that's what primaries are for. Go out and vote, make your voice heard. And no one can tell you who's going to be the next. They told us that, I just want to say one thing. Figure this out. Hillary said she sent 30,800 emails that she got and received back to the State Department. No one said, you were Secretary of State for 1,475 days. That's 20.8 emails a day. The janitor of the State Department gets more emails than that. What in the name of, what fairy tale are we talking about here? Everybody said she was inevitable? Don't think so, folks.
Thank you, and another reason to close our primaries. Thank you.
It again brings us back to why we're here, is to talk about the kinds of decisions you all will be helping to shape in this state. I think we've got time for one more. Please, Joe.
Frank, and this is to the panel as well. Even if we were to get the military buildup that we have, that you're looking for in your graphs and so forth, don't we have to fight and win the battle of political correctness first? I mean, when I watch TV and I hear Leon Panetta say that we need permission of the UN to go to war, not to Congress, I mean, that's the battle, the fundamental battle at the roots that we have to win in order to follow through and take the next step, which is your military buildup.
Let me answer it this way. We have a very far-left administration in office, correct?
Yes.
Every one of their officials say the budget caps on defense are a disaster for our national security policy. That's for their national security policy. Take what they just gave you, put it in your pocket, and run with it. The left has told you our national security is in jeopardy if we don't get rid of the budget caps. That's just a $35 billion increase, which gets you in the direction, say, thank you very much, take the argument and go with it. You don't have to convince them, even if they're lying. Take them at their face value. Take even Panetta and Gates and others have said the budget caps are crazy. Not just sequestration. Sequestration is the way you implement the budget caps. It's the crazy caps. Now, do we get bribed and say, oh, yes, Mr. President, we'll give you 200,000 federal employees, which is what you want in your budget for non-defense? Forget it. As I said, be audacious like Schumer, for God's sakes. Did we lose our ability to lay down a marker as what we're for? That's why you folks are upset with the Republican leadership. A good idea can overcome the banana heads inside the Beltway. Okay?
Admiral Lyons?
Yeah, let me just say on political correctness.
Mike?
Yeah, is it working? Okay, there we go. Political correctness is really a disease. It's infected every level of command throughout our military. You know, you have to step back. You know, we forced our military to fight in Afghanistan with restricted rules of engagement. In the idiotic hope that we were going to win the hearts and minds of a tribal society. This was nonsense.
Yes.
It cost many, many good American lives, plus those permanently injured. And that had to be signed off not only by our Commander-in-Chief, the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Unconscionable. It really never should have happened.
Thank you so much.
Anybody
sir.
else? Just a quick comment, because I think the political correctness, primarily the issue in the military is not facing the reality of radical Islam. And there's a whole separate panel on that, but I just want to give one quote from that thing I talked about, the Chief of Staff, Odierno, only about a month ago. And this is what he said. And this goes into political correctness issues and why it's so important to keep the defense spending and end sequestration as far as the military is concerned. What he said is, this is the most uncertain time I've seen under national security since I've been in uniform. He was commissioned in 1976 from West Point, which means he started in 1972. So we're talking 4.5 decades. This is the most uncertain time, and yet we're given a peace dividend. We're pretending we could go to the Pacific, and part of it goes into not facing the reality of who our enemy is, which is radical Islam, and that goes to political correctness. So thank you, Joe.
Admiral, we are out of time. I've got to bring the next panel up. I'm just going to close with one quick comment, if I may.
Okay.
This is an issue we will be touching on, I'm sure, again and again in the course of the day. I just want to impress upon you that as we think of what we're doing as political correctness, or if you will, multiculturalism or diversity, sensitivity, whatever other name we might assign to it, the enemy that Bill's just talking about and that we will be drilling down on after lunch has a different word for it. They call it submission. And when they see us doing that, their doctrine, they call it Sharia, obliges them to double down, to become more violent, because that's the way to make sure that we understand we're subdued. So this is really the context in which this panel's insights and recommendations as to what we do are so critical, and I can't thank you enough for joining us, gentlemen. God bless you.